Hello, everyone. Welcome to Chapter 1. Before I get into the material, I just want to tell you a little bit about the best way to study these PowerPoints. So you already have the PowerPoint uploaded onto Blackboard, so you should have that. Now, when you're going through these, what you want to focus on, because it may seem like there's a lot of material, which there is, the best way to approach it is to focus on everything that's in bold print or anything that's underlined or in italics. Okay, so if it's highlighted in any way, if it's bolded, if it's underlined or italicized, these points are the most likely points that you're going to be asked about on quizzes and exams. So that's how you want to look at it. Don't try to memorize every word. And in fact, some concepts, I'll go through and maybe I won't even mention a certain sentence or whatever. So focus on what is in bold, underlined, or italicized. That's the real high yield material as far as what you'll be tested on. Those are the most important concepts. So I want to just let you all know that first. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Okay, first slide. So, well, with any class, you have to start out defining what the name of the course is. So the name of the course is Anatomy and Physiology. So what is anatomy? You should know that anatomy is the study of the structure of parts of the body. So how is a part of the body made? What does it look like? How is it shaped? How does it fit together with other parts of the body? All right. So anatomy is really just a mechanical thing. All right. You are just studying the structure of something. And in lab, this is what we're really going to be dealing with in lab, is looking at different models of different parts of the body and systems of the body. And you will be responsible for knowing the structure of those parts as well as the names of those structures. So in anatomy, for most students, the most challenging part is the naming, all right? Remembering all of the complicated names of the parts of the body. And in this class, we're actually just scratching the surface. We're not even learning all of the parts of the body, just a select few, really. Okay, so just as a heads up for lab, that is something that will challenge you the most is the memorization, and pronouncing the names of the structures correctly and spelling them correctly. Okay, so anyway, anatomy, you're just dealing with a mechanical thing, all right? How something is structured. So what is physiology then? Physiology is different. Physiology is the study of the function of these body parts. How do these body parts work? And so you have to know anatomy, really, to understand physiology, because you can't talk about the different parts of the body and what they do if you don't know what those parts are, if you don't know the names of those parts, for example. So physiology is something we'll really be dealing with predominantly in lecture. In lecture, we will focus on physiology. You do, like I said, have to know some anatomy to understand physiology. But physiology has its challenges as well, because how digestion works, for example, or how the heart beats, for example. Taking the most complicated example, the brain. How does the brain work? So these functions are going to be challenging in the lecture part of the course. Okay, so anatomy and physiology go together. All right, and this relates to this concept called the principle of complementarity, where structure reflects function and vice versa. All right, so for example, how something is shaped dictates what kind of things it can do. All right, so what a structure does, how it functions, or its physiology is dictated by its structure or how it's shaped. All right, and so this is something you should that I think is very helpful to keep in the back of your mind when you're studying, especially when it comes to physiology. Trying to keep that idea in the back of your mind that physiology dictates, or let me say that differently, structure is going to reflect function. All right, so let's move on. All right, how do we examine structures? How do we examine anatomy? All right, now most of you, I think a lot of you are going into nursing or related health fields, so you'll be dealing with real people, and a lot of you will be giving physical exams to patients. And so these four, you should know these four. These are the four main ways that you're going to examine a part of the body. Okay, so inspection. Inspection is really the first thing that you do. Here, you're doing, when you first see the patient, you're doing a head-to-toe visual inspection of the body. You're just looking at the surface appearance. So, for example, is there any alteration in skin tone, such as cyanosis? Maybe you all have heard of cyanosis. Cyanosis is when you get a blue coloring to the skin, and we'll mention that again throughout the class on circumstances that would cause cyanosis. We'll bring that up again. So anyway, what is inspection? It is really just examining the surface appearance of the patient. Next, you have palpation. So this is where you're actually going to feel with your hands a part of the body. All right. And a lot of times, a patient will come in and say that they're having pain somewhere. Maybe they say they're having pain in their stomach, right? So what you would do, or what the doctor would do, is they would palpate that area and see if it evokes pain. And also this is for the inspector to feel around for any abnormality. All right, another example of palpation, which is not pathological, all right, is like when you take a person's pulse, for example. What you're doing is you're doing palpation. Next, you have auscultation, and this is simply when you're listening to sounds inside of the body that you can't normally really hear that well outside of the body. So we have this special mechanism called the stethoscope, which you all have seen before, and many of you will be using it a lot. All right, so this is how, for example, you would listen to the heartbeat. And not just the heartbeat, but other sounds in the body. You can listen to the to the abdominal area and really get a good sound for what's happening there, as well as the lungs. The lungs are very often auscultated. And lastly, you have percussion, and this is a more complicated procedure. It really takes a lot of practice, and it's really not used all the time, but it's very commonly used when you're examining the lungs. And it's really just a tapping. You're going to tap over a structure. So, for example, tapping over the lungs. Sometimes this is done when someone is, if it's suspected that someone has pneumonia or some sort of lung issue, they may perform this tapping on a structure, and you just simply do that with your finger. And again, it takes practice and experience, because you would need to know the difference on, what a pathological sound coming from that would be versus a non-pathological sound. All right, so those are your four, and I'm sure you'll have one question on your quiz and exam asking you about one of these four. All right, so anatomy. Again, how do we study the structure? Obviously, we use cadavers, all right? A lot of students have the opportunity to use a cadaver, and, obviously, you're going to have a pretty good learning experience with anatomy, since you're dealing with the human body there in real time. All right, comparative anatomy. Comparative anatomy is something we're always kind of doing. And this is really when you're studying multiple species, all right, to learn about how they differ or how they're similar in form, function, and evolution. All right, and like I said, this is done pretty often. For example, people who do research in labs, let's say someone's trying to find a drug to cure cancer. They're going to be using mice, for example, or monkeys, or whatever animal. And so they're looking at differences and similarities in how that animal might respond to that drug compared to a human before they can take it to the level of trying it out on humans. So comparative anatomy is pretty common. Okay, and so again, this slide is not a big deal. This is all pretty basic stuff. Just going into more ways that we study the structure of the body. Obviously, we use medical imaging, radiology. Maybe some of you are going into radiology or a related field. For you all, anatomy is definitely very important. You will always need to know anatomy if you're going to be a person who administers scans on people, like MRIs and that kind of thing. All right. And obviously this is the way that we're going to view the inside of the body. Gross anatomy. Gross anatomy is when we study the structures of the body using the naked eye. You can see them clearly. Histology. Now, histology will be very important. We will go through histology in chapter 5. And we will spend some time on that, both in lecture and lab. Histology is pretty important to know. And so histo, the prefix histo means tissue. So anytime you see the word histo, we're referring to some sort of tissue. All right. And so we're going to study tissues using a microscope, and we'll do that in the lab. All right. And again, break down your words. All right, if you're having trouble, which most students do, have trouble with the terminology in this class because we're dealing with words you maybe have never said, words maybe you've never heard of, complicated words. So whenever you're dealing with that and you're having a hard time understanding what a word means, or if you're having a hard time spelling it, break the word down. All right, break it down. So histo means tissue. Ology just means the study of. So literally this word translates to the study of tissue. Histopathology. What is pathology? What does patho mean, or path? This means disease, okay? So histopathology, then, you're studying tissues looking for signs of disease in that tissue. We will visit pathology quite often in this class. We will be bringing up and studying a variety of diseases, and that's considered pathology. Some of you may even be taking a course later on in your academic careers that is strictly devoted just to pathology. Very important subject for anyone going into the clinical field. You must know your diseases. And that's why you're taking anatomy and physiology, because you can't understand disease unless you understand how the human body works first. First, you have to know the parts of the body, how those parts work, and only then can you understand disease, and then the next step, which is treatment of the disease. Cytology, and this is a really important subject that we will also devote some time to. Cyto means cell. So we are going to study cells. Okay, physiology, the study of function. All right, so these are just examples of some of the subdisciplines of physiology. And they're all going to be really specific, okay? Most people who are experts in physiology, they're going to be experts in one particular system of the body. So neurophysiology, for example, these people who study this subject are going to be studying the nervous system, the physiology of the nervous system, and then so on. You're going to have a lot of different subdisciplines, and these are just examples. Okay. For your interest. Endocrinology, physiology of hormones. I think there was just an echo. Well, I hope the audio is working. Okay. And then comparative physiology, like comparative anatomy. We're going to be studying how physiology works in different species. Okay, so this is an important slide. You will definitely have a question about this. So hold on a second. I'll be right back. All right, I'm back. Sorry about that. I had my cat, I had to let my cat outside or else she will meow incessantly. All right, so the hierarchy of the human body. This is how the body is organized from, this slide presents it from largest to smallest level of organization of the human body. And like I said, you'll definitely have one question about this, so you should know the order. All right. So we can go from largest to smallest. So at the largest level, you are considered an organism. Okay, break the whole organism down, and you will come up with organ systems. Organ systems like cardiovascular system, immune system, and so on. Organ systems, if you break your organ systems down into its individual parts, then you will find organs. And so these organs that exist in each system, these organs are going to be those that work together for, all right, like let's say respiratory system. Respiratory system will contain organs like the lungs, all right, the trachea, and these organs work together for a similar goal, which is breathing and oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange. All right, so take your organs, break that down, and you break this down into tissues. Tissues, if you break this down into its smaller parts, you're going to find cells. If you break cells down into its smaller parts, you find organelles. If you break your organelles down, you find molecules. And then finally, if you break your molecules down, you find atoms. So you should know this level of organization from smallest to largest or largest to smallest. You might be asked either way. I think I have a couple more slides on this. Yeah. So just to simplify it for you, I just drew these little with these arrows here, and this is how you can memorize it. So this is from smallest to largest. You have atoms. Atoms come together to make up molecules. Molecules come together to make up organelles. Now, organelles are kind of like, so when you see this ending, E-L-L-E, that means miniature or small or mini, all right? So organelle is kind of like, in function, it's kind of like a miniature organ, all right? And we'll see how that is when we study the cells. Anyway, get the proper collection of organelles together, and you have a cell. When you have many cells put together, you can have a tissue. Now, when you get tissues together, let me go back here. Yeah, and I want to emphasize this. 2 or more types of tissues, okay? So when you get 2 or more types of tissues together, that's an important definition of what a tissue is. Or, I'm sorry, what an organ is. An organ is going to be made of 2 or more different types of tissue, all right? One example of that is, well, maybe a lot of you didn't know, or maybe you do, that blood vessels are actually considered organs. A lot of people don't know that. And the reason they are classified as organs is because they are made of 2 or more types of tissue. All right? Blood vessels are made of connective tissue. They're made of epithelial tissue. They're made of smooth muscle, which is a type of tissue. So you don't need to know that right now. All you need to take home with you right now is that in order for an organ to be classified as an organ, it must contain at least 2 different types of tissue. All right, once you have a collection of organs that work to carry out a similar goal, then you can say you have an organ system, right? Digestive system has what? Stomach, small intestines, large intestines, pancreas is part of the digestive system, so on. All of these work towards a similar goal, and that is the digestion and absorption of food. All right, so it's considered an organ system. And then once you have your whole collection of organ systems, then you are considered an organism. So you should definitely know this hierarchy of the level of organization of the body. And okay, so here's just a picture of this. This is from the textbook. Again, just sort of giving you an image of how this hierarchy is. And you can see the baby is the organism. Then we have organ system. Here they're showing digestive system. And then, you know, break that down and you have your individual organs. Each organ will be made of 2 or 3 different types of tissue. Break the tissue down and you have individual cells. Inside of each cell, you will have organelles. And then organelles inside will have molecules, and then the smallest, which is atoms. Here's another picture of this. This is not from your textbook. You'll notice that a lot. I like to give you a lot of pictures. Some of them will be from your textbook, some of them will not be. Just because I want you to see it as many examples as I can give you for whatever we're talking about. And so again, this is just another example of this. From this one's going from smallest to largest, and this one is detailing out the cardiovascular system, and we're dealing with a blood vessel here. Remember I said you have to have at least 2 different types of tissues to be considered an organ. This is why a blood vessel is an organ. It has epithelial tissue, smooth muscle, and connective tissue. Okay, so some basics here about the characteristics of life. So what kind of things or characteristics does one have to have in order to have life, basically, in a biological sense, all right? So yeah, we're talking about biology here. Well, there has to be an organization to the body, right? And we just went through that. We just went through the level of hierarchy of the human body, okay? And so that's an example of that. Cellular composition, all right? So all living matter is going to be made of at least 1 cell, all right? So there are some organisms, some types of bacteria, for example, that are only 1 cell, only 1 cell. Those are called acellular or unicellular organisms, all right? We are multicellular. That means we have a lot of cells. Metabolism. So for something to have life, it must be able to metabolize. And what is metabolism? This is a word that's thrown around a lot. It's really abused, and people really don't know what it means. But you all are going to know what it means. So very basic definition of metabolism is just simply chemical reactions that are occurring inside of the body. Digestion is the easiest example of metabolism that we can discuss, all right? So metabolism is actually broken down into many different types, all right? But we're going to focus on the 2 broad categories of metabolism, and that is catabolism and anabolism. And you should definitely know this. You will have questions about catabolism and anabolism for sure. So what's catabolism? Catabolism is when you're breaking something down. So example of this is digestion. All right, so anytime you take food or drink into your mouth, immediately in the mouth, you begin the process of catabolism. So you're breaking that stuff down right away. And this process of breakdown is going to continue to occur, all right, all the way down from the mouth down to the stomach, all right? So digestion is going to end at the stomach. All right, I'll mention that again later. But for now, just know catabolism is referring to the breaking down of substances. So anabolism is the opposite. Anabolism is going to be when you're building up something, okay? Synthesis, all right, if you're making something. So example of this would be like hormones, all right? We make our own hormones, yeah. So we're always, going through this process of hormone synthesis. We're building up our hormones like estrogen and testosterone and all kinds of things, and neurotransmitters in the brain like dopamine and serotonin, for example. All right, you don't need to know those examples, but you do need to know. Anabolism is referring to the breakdown of substances. So metabolism is collectively this cycling process of catabolism, breaking things down, and those things that we break down, we're actually using to help perform anabolism. So all the things you eat, right? Protein, carbohydrates, those things that you consume, you're going to catabolize them, and then we're going to use those same products like protein and carbohydrates and fats to do anabolism, to make those other things that we need. What else do we have to have in order to be considered a life? You have to have the ability to respond to your environment. All right, responsiveness, the ability to sense and react to stimuli. All right, an example of this is the withdrawal reflex. So this is like, let's say you're walking along outside and you step on a nail. All right, so let's say you stepped on a nail with your right foot. So your immediate response, right, you're going to respond to this. All right, as long as you have your sensory intact, you will have a response to this, and the response is the withdrawal reflex. So what you will do is, once you step on that nail with the right foot, you withdraw the right foot. You pull the right leg up away from the dangerous stimulus. All right, and there's definitely other things involved in that. We'll talk about that at the end of the course. Let's see. Control of breathing rate. Okay, so yeah, this is another example of responsiveness. We could go on forever and ever about different examples of responsiveness. All right, these are just two examples. Breathing rate. So breathing rate is going to change based on your level of activity, for example, right? When you're exercising, your breathing rate will increase, for example. And this is considered a type of response. It's a response to something that you're doing, right? You're increasing your level of physical activity. You're exercising. And so that is going to cause the body to respond by increasing breathing rate. Other characteristics, movement. So to have life, all right, there must be some kind of movement possible in that life. All right, now, most obvious example is that you're able to move a body part. All right, you're able to walk around, you're able to pick things up. But I want you to note that this is not the only thing that is meant by movement. All right. What I would say is the more important aspect of this whole idea of you having to have movement to be considered a life is really referring to movement inside of the body. You absolutely must have movement happening inside of the body, or else you are not alive. All right. So, for example, you can be, paralyzed. All right. Well, let's say, we have someone who's paralyzed from in the legs. Let's say the legs are paralyzed. Well, yeah, they're not able to induce the movement of those body parts, but are they still able to have substances move around in their body? Yes. That's why they're still alive. Okay. You are no longer alive if you cannot do this. So, most common example is blood. We have to be able to transport or move blood all around the inside of the body. Okay. Digestion, right? This is an example of movement that occurs inside of the body because we are propelling food along all through the digestive tract. All right, what else? Homeostasis, really important. I want to say this is probably the most important concept in all of chapter 1. You'll definitely be asked several questions that relate to your understanding of homeostasis. So homeostasis is referring to, very simply put, a balance. All right. So balance in all things inside of the body. All right. And it's basically the body's ability to keep internal conditions stable. Okay. And so if these internal conditions are not kept stable, then we go out of homeostasis. We go out of homeostasis, and we're going to talk about what the body does when that happens. All right, development. Yeah, to be considered life, development. And what's meant by this is cell division. So we must have some types of cells have the ability to divide and turn into more cells. One cell divides and turns into 2 cells. Those 2 cells divide and that turns into 4 cells. All right, that's something we'll cover in lab, actually. And growth, right? Development refers to growth, increase in size, up to a point. Reproduction. Now, this is an interesting one, right? Because, okay, reproduction, we're talking about passing genes to offspring, making copies of yourself. Now, obviously, you don't have to reproduce in order to be alive. All right? Plenty of people do not reproduce and they're still alive. Okay, so yeah, that's kind of one your book throws in there. I'm not real fond of, but it is what it is. All right, evolution. Now, definitely, life is characterized by this evolution, which is refers to changes in genes over long periods of time. Okay, so let's get into this really, really important topic for chapter 1, and that is homeostasis. Gotta know it, gotta know it. Okay, so like I said, homeostasis is referring to a balance or an equilibrium of something inside of the body. All right, and we're going to talk about specific examples that you'll definitely want to know. Okay, so homeostasis, we're maintaining relatively stable conditions all the time in an equilibrium state. Okay, and our body will readjust as needed. Now, what participates in homeostasis? Well, really all organ systems, okay, are going to play a role in homeostasis, just depending on what it is exactly that we're trying to stabilize. It depends. But we'll see that there are 2 systems in particular that are most commonly involved. Now, there are 2 types of homeostasis, 2 types. We have one, which is called negative feedback, and our second one, which is called positive feedback. You will need to understand how both of these work, as well as examples of both of these. Okay, so let's deal with negative feedback. Negative feedback, what's going to happen is, okay, so first of all, something, let's say body temperature, okay? Body temperature has a set point. Normal body temperature has a set point of 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. All right, that's our limited range there for body temperature. All right, now what if body temperature rises beyond normal? What if it decreases below normal? What we'll see is negative feedback, and what that means is that the body senses this change in body temperature, and a process will begin that results in reversing that change or canceling that change or negating that change. That's why it's called negative feedback. We're going to have a reversal in the direction. Okay, so for example, let's say body temperature rises high, all right? The body is going to go through a process to lower, okay, to reverse that. Okay, so that's why it's called negative feedback. Now, in general here, if you lose the ability to maintain homeostasis, if your negative feedback or positive feedback systems fail, it can actually cause death. All right, that's how important homeostasis is. And we'll find throughout this course, and when you do 130 Bio 19, that almost all the diseases, many of the diseases that you'll study are related to some problem with homeostasis. Okay, many diseases. That's why it's so important for you to know. All right, so again, negative feedback. It is the most used feedback mechanism. All right, most of the homeostasis control is going to be by negative feedback. And again, what it does is it reduces or shuts off the original stimulus. All right, I'm gonna talk about specific examples of this so you really understand it. Okay, so the response from negative feedback, the final result is that you're gonna have a variable such as body temperature change in the opposite direction of the initial change, right? Okay, so many examples, but we're gonna use these. Body temperature. Regulation of blood glucose is another type of negative feedback, and I'll go through that with you. So body temperature is, it says here it's a nervous system mechanism. So really, yeah, it's going to be a specific part of the brain that controls the response to changes in body temperature. When it comes to glucose levels, all right, when it comes to how much glucose is floating around in the blood, that is going to be controlled by the endocrine system, which we'll talk about. Okay, so before we talk about those specific examples, we need to understand, my phone keeps going, let me turn it off. So there are three parts, three components to any feedback system. Sometimes the feedback systems, negative feedback, positive feedback, are called loops. Okay, that's because you're going from start to finish. Basically, it's like a circle loop. So very important that you know, this is a very important slide because your three components to any feedback system are listed here. Okay. Now, in a question, quiz or exam question, guaranteed question is going to be asking you, okay, to identify specifically the three different parts of the feedback system: receptor, control center, effector. These are the three parts of any homeostatic system. And so I might present to you a scenario where there is some change, all right? There's a lack of homeostasis. And you will be asked to identify the receptor, the control center, and the effector in that scenario. That scenario might be one we've talked about. It might be one we've not talked about. It doesn't matter if it's one we haven't talked about, because regardless, you should be able to pick out the receptor, the control center, and the effector in that scenario. Okay, so what are they? The receptor is the initial structure in the body that detects that change. All right, again, I'm going to go through examples of these here in a minute. Okay, so the receptor is really like the first part of the system. The control center, or sometimes called the integrating center. The control center is just what it sounds like. This is the part of the homeostatic loop that's going to direct the response to this change. All right, it's basically what makes a decision about how we're going to get back to normal, how we're going to get back to equilibrium. And just a key thing to keep in mind, almost always, not always, but almost always, the control center is going to be a part of the nervous system. All right, so it might be a specific part of the brain, or it will be part of the endocrine system. Now, the endocrine system contains all of your glands. things like sweat glands, for example, or the pancreas. The pancreas is actually a gland, all right? So anyway, nervous or endocrine almost always are going to be your control center. So you should not have any problem picking out a control center in a scenario that you're presented with. The third one is the effector, and this is really the last part of the loop. So this is going to be the structure of the body that carries out this final response that was directed by the control center. All right, it's going to carry out that final response that does restore homeostasis. Okay, so here's an example of where you will identify these three in a negative feedback situation. So let's take blood glucose. All right, blood glucose. A lot of people say blood sugar. Your textbook says blood sugar. Sugar is really not the best word to use there because there are a lot of different kinds of sugar. All right. Glucose isn't the only kind of sugar. You have sucrose and maltose and lactose and galactose and all kinds of them. All right. But people have really, generalized this. Okay. But really, I think it's good if you get into the habit of being specific. And instead of saying blood sugar, go ahead and say what it really is, and that is glucose. All right, so here's the deal. Let's say you've just had a meal, and let's say glucose, which was retrieved from that meal from catabolism, right? Catabolism is the breakdown of food. That food is ultimately going to be broken down into glucose, all right? And so glucose is going to need to get inside of your cells in order to help your cells function. Cells need glucose to function. So after your meal, you've broken down all this food down into its minimal parts, known as glucose, some of it. Now say you've got so much glucose there that not all of it is able to get inside of the cell. The cell can only take in so much glucose at once, all right? And this is what relates to pathologies such as diabetes, all right, where, there's a problem getting glucose inside of the cell. So what happens then is the glucose is just hanging out there in the bloodstream instead, all right? So you end up with high blood glucose. Okay, this is not normal, all right? This takes you out of homeostasis. High or increased blood glucose means your body is going to go and start off this negative feedback process, okay? So what's the receptor in this situation? Very simple. The receptor in this situation is the one that's picking up the initial change. It's a receptor that's on the surface of body cells that senses when there is high glucose in the blood. Those receptors then are going to send input. These receptors send information about this to the control center. All right. In this case, the control center, which is going to make a decision, all right, or direct a response to this problem, in this case is the pancreas. And remember I said the pancreas is actually part of the endocrine system. And endocrine system is often involved here as a control. So the pancreas then is going to respond to this input from these receptors with a certain action. And that action is going to be to secrete insulin into the blood. Now, what's insulin? We could go and talk about this all day too. But I'm hoping you'll cover that in part 2 of this course. Insulin, for our purposes right now, is a hormone that is made and secreted by the pancreas when there is high blood glucose. So this insulin then is secreted from the pancreas, it's transported through the bloodstream, and it goes over to these cells that need to get that glucose, and it's going to trigger those cells to allow that glucose to come in, all right? And this right here is a very complicated process that involves a lot of details. All right, so we don't have time to go into that. All we need to know right now for you all is that this insulin then is going to go and travel to the third part of this loop, and that is the effector. And the effector is simply going to be insulin receptors on body cells. All right, and so insulin will bind to those receptors, these little structures on the outside of body cells, and that's going to cause the cells to absorb or take in more blood glucose. And so what's the final result of this process? We're going to have a reversal of what the original problem was. That is why it's called negative. We're going in the opposite direction with the problem, right? First, we had an increase in blood glucose. Now we end with a decrease in blood glucose because now we're able to take that glucose into the cells. All right, so you should know that example. You should know how to identify receptor, control center, and effector. All right, so let's take another example, and this is probably the most important example, all right, for this class, is this example of negative feedback, and that is body temperature, all right. Okay, so before we go through that slide, I just want to mention that you should know this too. I'm sure at some point you'll have a question about this because this is going to be part of the body's response to changes in body temperature. Okay, if body temperature rises, okay, so if you're going above this 98.6, blood vessels in the skin dilate. All right, that means the vessels get larger. And this is going to help contribute to the process of sweating. All right, and what is sweating? It's simply the loss of heat from evaporation. All right, you will have the loss of heat from the body through the secretion of this fluid known as sweat. Okay, so this will help, okay, decrease the body temperature back to normal. Vessels will get larger, okay, and part of the effect of these vessels getting larger is that the increase in size of the vessels places pressure on surrounding sweat glands, and that forces the sweat out of the gland. Okay, so that's part of what's going on there. All right, you should know what happens if it's the opposite. If it's too cold, all right, if you're going below our normal 98.6, we're going to have the opposite. We're going to have vessels in the skin constrict instead. Constrict means they're going to become more narrow, all right? And so if they're more narrow, we're not going to be placing pressure on our sweat glands, so you won't be sweating. And then you're going to have this process shivering, and I'm going to explain how that is caused, all right? And then what this helps do, okay, constricting the vessels, okay, making the vessels in the skin more narrow. What that does, and this is important, what that does is it causes the blood in the skin to flow towards the inside of the body and away from the outside. Okay? Vessels constricting in the skin diverts blood flow from the outer part of the body, from the skin, to the inside of the body where all your organs are. Okay, so that's important. That's why we're having blood vessel constriction in the skin when we're cold. All right. Why do we want all that blood to go away from the skin and go to the organs? Because when you're cold, you need to make sure that your organs are hot enough to function. Okay. Why is this 98.6? Because the organs need this high temperature to function. Okay. It's all about your organs being able to function. All right. You get too cold and you don't get back to this 98.6, your organs will fail. All right. So this is the whole idea here with constricting blood vessels in the skin. You want to divert any blood supply that's in the skin to the cardiovascular system for your heart, you know, to the respiratory system for your lungs, that kind of stuff, right? You know, divert to liver, kidneys, all that. You want all that blood flow to go inward. That should make sense. This is definitely in bold. You should know normal body temperature is 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. You got to know that number forever, all right? Now, really, any slight deviation from this, and you can be considered out of homeostasis. Here is a picture that is not in your book, okay? But it details out this process of body temperature regulation, all right? So let's look up here to the top part of this seesaw. The seesaw is representing balance or homeostasis, okay? And then if it teeter-totters, it's like we're having an imbalance. So what happens up here? Up top is representing when body temperature increases above normal. Okay, so first, remember our three parts. We have a receptor, control center, effector. Receptor in this situation is temperature-sensitive cells in the skin and the brain. Now, you know, temperature-sensitive receptors, or it says here, temperature-sensitive cells, really, there are specific names for those, but we're just going to generalize it, all right? So receptor in this situation is temperature-sensitive receptors, or you can just say temperature-sensitive cells. All right, these pick up the fact that body temperature is rising. Those receptors send input, you should know this, input along what we call, and you should know this word, it's called the afferent pathway. Afferent. Afferent means we're going towards the control center. All right, towards. We will see this word afferent later. So receptors send input through the afferent pathway to the control center. All right. The control center is going to be a specific part of the brain that regulates body temperature. And I'm going to go to the whiteboard real quick if I can. Let's see here now. How do I do that? Just a second, guys. I'm going to try to get to the whiteboard. Not sure why I can't get to the whiteboard. Okay. Well, I'm going to try it at the end. I'll make a note to myself here because I want you guys to know the specific name of this part of the brain. Very important. All right, so, all right. This part of the brain you need to know. It's called the hypothalamus. All right. If you don't know how to spell that, don't worry about it right now. I'm going to try and get to the whiteboard at some point here and write that down for you. Okay. So the hypothalamus, you should know specifically that it's the hypothalamus that controls or regulates body temperature. Okay. We're going to talk about that part of the brain a lot. Anyway, so the hypothalamus, which is in the brain, is going to send directions about a response on how to correct this increase in body temperature. So the control center sends output along what we call the efferent pathway. Efferent means we're going away from the center. Afferent means we're going towards. Efferent means we're going away. All right, so along the efferent pathway, output is sent by the control center to the effector. All right, so the Effector, okay, sorry. The effector in this case are going to be sweat glands. All right, so sweat glands will be stimulated. All right, they're going to be stimulated to secrete sweat. That's the deal. All right, what's your response? You're going to have evaporation of sweat from the skin. This is going to lead to the body temperature decreasing. All right, and then there you have it. Now you're back to balance. All right, remember also the role of blood vessels here. Blood vessels in the skin are going to dilate, and that's also going to play a role in placing pressure on surrounding sweat glands to force them to secrete as well. So you sort of have a double effect here on your sweat glands. What about the bottom example? Bottom example is when it's too cold. All right. So first we're going to have receptor. Receptor in this case is the same receptor we saw in the other example. Same thing. Temperature sensitive cells or temperature sensitive receptors in the skin and brain detect a decrease in body temperature. These are going to send input along the afferent pathway to the control center, which guess what is the same. All right. The hypothalamus is going to direct a response. It's going to send output along the efferent pathway. Now this is where it's different. Okay, if it's cold, our effectors are going to be different. The effector in this case is going to be skeletal muscle. Why is this? Because what we're doing is we're stimulating skeletal muscle to contract. Now, this relates to concept in physics, where anytime you have movement, all right, so for example, muscle contraction, anytime you have movement, heat is a byproduct of that movement. It's just like if you take your hands, your palms, and you rub your palms together and you create this friction, you're going to feel heat. Okay, so anytime there is movement, okay, this can be at the molecular level, movement, a result of that is the production of heat. Okay, so this is why we shiver, all right? Your skeletal muscles are being stimulated to contract, and so you start to shiver or shake. And that helps conserve heat by producing heat, all right? You should know this slide backwards and forwards because you'll definitely have a question on how we maintain body temperature, all right? This slide, not a real big deal. It's just kind of giving you a graph here, a visual on, based on what your body temperature is, what your level of vessel constriction or dilation is going to be like, all right? So the hotter you are, all right, the more blood vessel dilation you're going to have, all right? The colder you are, the more vasoconstriction, okay? Vasoconstriction or blood vessel constriction, you're going to have that happening. Okay, now we're almost done here. Okay, so negative feedback, we talked about it. Very important topic. Well, remember, there's a second kind of homeostasis, and that is positive feedback. So positive feedback is different, all right? It's different in the sense that instead of reversing the stimulus or the response that we're having to a certain stimulus, we're going to increase that same response in the same direction. Okay, so for example, if you have an increase in a level of a hormone, then you'll continue through positive feedback to have an even greater increase in that hormone. Now, that's why positive feedback is, okay? Most of the time we're dealing with negative feedback, but there are some very important physiological examples, okay, or situations where you need positive feedback in order for the proper result to happen, okay? And we're going to talk about examples of that, okay? So you're still going to have your receptor, control center, effect. You'll have a three, all right? Now, again, on a quiz or exam, you might be given an example of positive feedback and be asked to identify, first of all, is it positive or negative feedback? Secondly, identify the three components: receptor, control center, and effector. Right. So yeah, the response that occurs as a result of positive feedback is going to enhance or exaggerate that original stimulus. And again, this is in special situations. So here are a few special situations where you see this happen. During labor, all right? So when a woman is having a baby, okay, we see this positive feedback, and we're going to talk about that here in a second specifically. Another example is platelet plug formation, or otherwise known as blood clotting. All right, and then nerve signaling. We're really not going to talk about that yet, okay? We will much later. All right, so this is not in your book, and I'm not going to ask that you know the steps here. I'm only including this as an example of positive feedback just quickly, all right? So blood clotting, right? Blood clotting is an example of positive feedback, and the reason for that is that if you get an injury to a blood vessel and you start to bleed, well, all of the little chemicals and proteins that are needed to stop the bleeding, you need to have a continual release of these items through positive feedback in order to stop the bleeding. Okay, and so these chemicals will continue and continue and continue and continue at high levels to be triggered to come to that area until a final goal is achieved, in this case, which would be the clot that forms there. Okay, so again, do not memorize this, all right? All you need to know is that blood clotting is an example of positive feedback. Okay, now the details of the next example you definitely want to know, all right? So positive feedback in childbirth, all right? So here's what happens. She's pregnant, about 9 months or whatever, and the baby is ready to come out. All right, so due to the size of this baby, the baby is pressing on the uterus. Okay, it's pressing on the uterus. And I'm also going to want you to know this, and I'll have to write it down for you. Okay, so what's your receptor in this situation? The receptor in this situation, and again, don't worry because I'll write this down for you if you don't get it. The receptor are known as stretch sensitive receptors in the uterus. Okay, stretch sensitive receptors in the uterus. Okay, so these little receptors that are all along the uterine wall are sensitive to stretch. So the baby is pushing on the uterus, and those stretch receptors get activated. The stretch receptors then are going to send input along an afferent pathway to the control center, which, no surprise, the control center is going to be the brain. Now, the brain then, and I want you to know what part of the brain. It's the pituitary gland. All right, the pituitary gland, which interestingly is a perfect example of a structure that is part of two different systems of the body. The pituitary gland is part of the nervous system. It's also part of the endocrine system, okay, because it is a gland. Okay, so you can say here, what's the control center? You can say nervous system or endocrine system. Both are correct. So the pituitary gland in the brain, and you must know this, is going to secrete this hormone called oxytocin. Oxytocin. Okay? So oxytocin is released from the pituitary gland, and it is sent along down the efferent pathway. This is considered output from the pituitary gland along the efferent pathway down to the effector. What's the effector going to be in this case? The effector is going to be smooth muscle. You need to know this. The effector in this case is smooth muscle in the uterus. So smooth muscle is going to be stimulated by oxytocin to contract. And so when these contractions happen, that's when you know, that's what the woman is feeling. All right, this discomfort from these really serious contractions. And the thing is, the contractions increase. They will continue and continue and continue to increase until the final result is had when the baby is out. All right, once the baby's gone out of there, then the contractions will stop because the final goal has been achieved. Okay, so this is why we need positive feedback to happen in this case. We're having an increase in oxytocin. The positive feedback here is that we're having an increase release of oxytocin. High amounts will continue to be released from the brain over time and endlessly until our final goal is achieved when the baby is out. Because at that point, we don't need to have contractions anymore, right? Because the baby's out. Okay, so positive feedback. All right, so we're basically done with chapter 1. I mean, this last page, this last slide here is just sort of a reminder about how we're going to have complicated terms to know, and we need to know how to spell them. So some of you might actually be registered right now in a medical terminology course, which is really great if you are. If not, I do recommend taking one at some point because it will help you. All right. Our terms here in anatomy mainly come from Greek and Latin. So if you've had any classes where you learn some Greek and Latin, or if you're taking medical terminology, this is really going to help you because a lot of our anatomy terms are roots, prefixes, suffixes, and base words come from Greek and Latin. So it helps a lot to know these. All right. Now, and as we go, I will definitely be mentioning these and telling you what they mean so that you have a better understanding of the word. All right, and you want to be precise, right? I mean, you all are going into medical fields, health fields. You're going to be in clinics and hospitals. You're going to be filling out paperwork. You're going to be talking to people, and you know it's going to be really bad if you don't know how to spell, right? You got to be able to spell these things. You got to be able to spell oxytocin, right? You got to be able to pronounce oxytocin. If you don't spell it or pronounce it right, it just makes you look bad. So you want to be precise, and this may involve practicing writing out your terms, practice pronouncing them out loud. You want to try to talk to people, have conversation and using the different terms of anatomy. All right? Yeah. So that's all I have for this. Now, real quick, let me see if I can get to the whiteboard. Just bear with me for a second. I'm not sure why I'm not seeing. Hold on, I'll find it. I will find it. I think my computer's a little slow. Let's see. Here we go. Share blank whiteboard. Okay, so first thing, and you won't see this until I'm finished with it. All right. Was that I wanted you to know the name of the part of the brain. Oh my gosh, this looks really bad. Oh my. Oh, this looks really bad, guys. I might just have to add this to your slides. I mean, I'm going to show it to you, see if you see it. Looks really bad, guys. Guys, you know what? Forget this. It just looks so bad. All right, so the things I wanted you to know that were not specifically in the PowerPoint was, number one, know that the hypothalamus is the part of the brain that controls, regulates body temperature. And the next thing was the sequence with the positive feedback for childbirth. All right, identifying the three components of when we're having childbirth for positive feedback. The receptors are the stretch-sensitive receptors in the uterus. The control center is the pituitary gland in the brain, and you should know that that's going to secrete the hormone oxytocin. Oxytocin then travels down to the effector, and the effector in this case is going to be smooth muscle on the uterus. All right? Okay, I'll try to just incorporate that into the slides and erase that terrible looking thing. Okay, well, that's chapter 1. I think I went a little longer than I wanted to on that, but I'm hoping that you all are able to watch this, and chapter 1 shouldn't be a problem for you. All right. Just keep updated with my announcements on Blackboard, and everyone's going to be just fine. So I will have another lecture covering Atlas A as soon as I can this week. All right. Thanks, guys. Have a great day.